Chapter 1. The Room That Waited. The boarding house was 3 stories tall, narrow as a coffin, and older than anyone living inside it. It leaned slightly to one side, like it was perpetually whispering a secret to the overgrown hedge that crept around the porch columns. Evelyn arrived on a Monday, dragging behind her a wheeled suitcase with one missing tooth on the zipper. She was not the sort of woman who asked questions or demanded comforts. She wore sensible shoes, carried a sensible umbrella, and had been recently laid off from a secretarial position that she'd held for nearly 2 decades. Her expression never varied, not even when the landlady, a woman with dry lips and hands like broomsticks, said, "You can have the 3rd-floor room. Most people don't like it." Evelyn only blinked. "Why?" she asked politely. The landlady's mouth twitched. "Oh," she said vaguely. "It's just a bit drafty." The stairwell was narrow and turned sharply at odd angles, the kind of stairs where you had to be careful not to lean too far in any direction, or the house might swallow you whole. The 3rd-floor room was at the end of a long hallway that sloped just enough to make walking feel like falling. The door itself was unusually tall and narrow, as though made for someone thinner than normal, or taller than comfortable. The key turned with a dry crack, and Evelyn stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. The wallpaper was yellowed, the bed narrow, the ceiling sloped down as if bowing its head in grief. A single window overlooked the garden below, but the glass was mottled, as if someone had breathed on it for years and never wiped it clean. Evelyn unpacked in silence. She did not speak to the other tenants, who rarely ventured beyond the 2nd floor. She did not inquire about the scratch marks on the baseboards, or the way her light flickered only between 2 and 3 a.m. She did not comment on the cold draft that came not from the window, but from under the bed. Instead, she settled in. She was, after all, very tired. Chapter 2. Sounds from Beneath. On her 3rd night, Evelyn woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't her own. It was soft, rhythmic, steady, like someone sleeping just under the floorboards. Not the hurried pant of a trapped animal, but the calm exhale of someone who knew they weren't alone. Evelyn lay still, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, which slanted so steeply it felt as though the house were pressing down on her. She did not panic. She had long since learned that panic was useless. Instead, she listened. The breathing came from below. Or rather, from beneath her. Under the bed, perhaps, or somewhere behind the wooden vent near the floor. There was no central heat in the room, just that one rusted grate that gave off no warmth, but sometimes hummed, faintly, like a voice trying to clear its throat. In the morning she asked the landlady casually, "Is there another tenant above me?" The landlady blinked. "No one above you, dear. You're on the top floor." And below me, a pause, a long one. Just the 2nd-floor tenants, quiet as mice, most of them. You'll get used to the old bones of this place. She settles a lot. She, not it. Evelyn noticed that. That afternoon she found the bookshelf in the corner wasn't bolted to the wall as she'd assumed. It moved slightly when she brushed against it. Behind it, faintly pressed into the peeling wallpaper, was the outline of what used to be a door. A narrow one, as tall and thin as the room's entrance, sealed over and papered shut. That night, the breathing returned. But it wasn't just breathing anymore. It was a whisper. Not words, not exactly. Just a susurration, like the sound of skirts brushing against floorboards, or fingernails dragging lightly along painted wood. A sound meant to be noticed, but not understood. A sound that was patient. It grew bolder the longer she lay still. when she finally moved, to turn on the light, to mark some line between night and not night, the bulb sputtered, fizzed, and went black. And then silence, heavy and waiting. Evelyn slept with the covers pulled to her chin, one hand curled loosely around the handle of her umbrella. It felt foolish. It also felt necessary. The next morning, the landlady left a note outside her door. It read, "If something bothers you at night, it's best not to answer." There was no signature. Chapter 3. A crack in the wallpaper. By the end of the first week, Evelyn had begun to notice that the wallpaper was changing. It was not dramatic, not a shift in color or pattern, but a quiet rearrangement, like the paper was peeling back ever so slightly in certain places, especially in the far left corner of the room, where the ceiling sloped low and the floor creaked without pressure. At first, it seemed like age. A house like this would settle, crack, stretch. But then the crack grew, not outward, downward. It began as a hairline split, no longer than a fingernail, running along the faded floral border. But each morning it extended, gently, thoughtfully, as though someone was slicing the paper open with a razor, a half-inch at a time. Evelyn stared at it from her bed. She counted the tiny threads of exposed plaster like tally marks. On the 7th day, she tried to tape it shut. By the next morning, the tape was gone. She never heard it tear, never found the curled edges on the floor. Just smooth wallpaper again, only now the crack was longer and darker. There was a mirror above the writing desk in the corner, old, cloudy, bordered in flaking gilt. Evelyn rarely looked into it. It seemed to warp things just slightly, like the slope of the room was worse in the reflection, like her shoulders looked thinner than they were, like the corner with the crack didn't quite line up with reality. That day she looked directly into it. She forced herself to. What she saw made her chest tighten. In the mirror, the crack was wide open, like a gash in the wall, a slit, maybe 2 inches across. Black on the inside, not shadowed black, but swallowed black, thick and endless, like the space between two thoughts. She turned her head quickly to look at the actual wall, still sealed. She looked back in the mirror, wide open, and something moved behind it, slow, shifting, like a hand withdrawing. That night, Evelyn left the hall light on and her door open. She wrapped a cardigan over her nightdress and sat in the narrow bed with her knees drawn up, like a woman waiting for an apology that never comes. At 3:17 a.m., the crack sighed. It was a sound, low and breathy, a sound like the room exhaling. And Evelyn, without meaning to, said aloud, "I'm still here." She didn't know who she was talking to, but the wallpaper crackled softly in reply, like fingertips brushing against paper, like something pleased to be noticed. Chapter 4. The Voice in the Mirror. On the 9th day, Evelyn stopped turning the mirror to the wall. She had tried. The night before, she had pulled it from the hook and faced it inward, pressing its back against the plaster like a guilty confession. But sometime in the night, there'd been a faint scraping, and in the morning, the mirror was hanging again, right side up, dead center above the desk. And it was clean. The glass had been cloudy before, silvering at the edges, the way old mirrors forget themselves. But now it gleamed, not bright exactly, but clear. Too clear, like it had been waiting to see her properly. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, her slippers dangling just above the floor, and stared into the mirror. It stared back. There was no distortion now. The room behind her was perfect in the reflection. So perfect, in fact, that it made her question which one was real. She leaned closer. Her face looked the same, but her eyes didn't. They were softer, curious. The kind of eyes you might expect on a woman who smiled often, who left the house for things like flowers or cake. Not Evelyn's eyes. Not anymore. And then her reflection blinked, just a moment too late. Evelyn jerked back. The mirror didn't move. She stared, and then faintly, like sound filtering through cotton, she heard it. Her reflection was whispering. No sound came from the room itself. No breeze stirred the curtains. But inside the glass, a voice moved. It did not speak words. Not at first. It breathed syllables that tugged at the edge of memory. It sounded like her mother. Maybe. Or a childhood friend whose name she no longer remembered. The kind of voice that knows you well enough to hurt you softly. Evelyn leaned in. Her hand touched the frame. It was warm. The voice inside the mirror said, "You forgot me." And Evelyn, before she could stop herself, whispered, "I didn't mean to." The reflection smiled. Just a little. The kind of smile that closes doors. Later that night, Evelyn placed a blanket over the mirror. She said it was to help her sleep. But really, it was to give the voice something to push against. The crack in the wallpaper had widened again. It now stretched from the corner of the ceiling down to the baseboard. It was shaped like a leaning tree, or maybe a woman bending over. She dreamed of someone standing in the room with her, not watching her, but waiting. When she woke, the blanket was folded neatly at the foot of her bed, and the mirror whispered, "We're almost ready." Chapter 5. Beneath the floorboards. The floor creaked differently now, not just beneath her feet, but in long, slow stretches, like something below was shifting its weight. Something with joints. Something that had learned the rhythm of the house and had begun to match it. Evelyn stopped stepping barefoot on the floor. She wore her slippers at all times, even to bed. She moved carefully, gently, as though afraid of waking something that no longer needed sleep. It was on the 12th night that she dropped her earring. Just a small thing. Gold, round, given to her long ago by a man whose name she hadn't spoken in years. It rolled beneath the bed, tucked itself into the shadows. When she knelt to retrieve it, she froze. There was a hole in the floor, not large, no bigger than a coin. But it hadn't been there before. She was certain. She knew the shape of the floorboards like she knew the slope of her own spine. This was new. She peered into it. Darkness. But not the flat kind. This was thick. It had depth, texture. She could hear something inside it. Not clearly, but the suggestion of sound, like a fingernail tapping glass, like a heart beating softly under too much earth. For 3 days, she watched the hole. She sat in the desk chair and stared at it, feeling as though it might widen under her gaze. The mirror behind her hummed sometimes, not with sound, but pressure. The air around it shimmered occasionally like heat. She no longer dared to look directly into it. The whispers had changed. They were no longer merely curious or bitter. They had become coaxing, inviting. "You're almost ready? We're waiting." It was never a room. It was a door. On the 15th night, something pushed up through the hole. Not fully, just a fingertip. Pale, slender, almost translucent, like something grown in moonlight. It did not move, but it tapped. Once, twice. Evelyn did not scream. She only said in a voice too calm, "Not yet," and the fingertip retreated. The next morning she woke with dirt beneath her fingernails, and a new crack in the mirror. This one ran across her reflection's throat. Chapter 6. The guest who never leaves. The boarding house had 8 tenants. Or maybe 7. Evelyn wasn't sure anymore. She remembered greeting someone on the 2nd floor. A woman in a mauve cardigan who smelled like starch and mothballs. They had exchanged polite smiles once, maybe twice. But now she couldn't picture her face. She couldn't even remember the sound of her own knock on the woman's door. It was as if the tenant had faded, and Evelyn had begun to worry she might be doing the same. She found herself staring at things she used to understand. A pair of scissors, the calendar above the desk, her own handwriting on the grocery list, and feeling like a stranger had left them behind. She forgot to eat lunch on Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday. She found a pair of shoes by the door she didn't recognize. Men's shoes. Worn, polished once upon a time. Toes scuffed like they'd paced in small, anxious circles. She picked them up and held them to her chest without knowing why. They were warm. The mirror had cracked fully now. The single fracture that crossed her reflection's throat had branched like lightning, splintering outward in quiet webs. Yet when she looked at herself, the face looking back smiled more easily. It seemed younger, calmer. The eyes were wrong, though. Still too soft, too pleased. The voice in the mirror had grown quiet these past nights. Not gone, but reserved. Like it was watching, evaluating, deciding whether or not to speak again. Evelyn missed it more than she wanted to admit. She whispered to it now, even without reply. I remember less each day. Is that the price? The mirror didn't answer, but beneath the floor, something chuckled, low and hollow, like air escaping a sealed jar. That night, Evelyn heard footsteps outside her door. Software, deliberate. They stopped just before the threshold. She waited, breath caught. Then, a knock. 3 gentle taps. Not rushed, not uncertain, just patient. She rose, heart a dull thump in her chest, and opened the door slowly. No one was there. But on the floor was a note, handwritten in neat, looping script. Welcome. You're not a guest anymore. The hallway was darker than usual that night. Longer, somehow. She stood in the doorway for a long time, trying to remember what it had looked like before. The next morning, her room had no door. Just a wall, smooth and yellow with faded paper. The crack, now gone. No one answered when she called downstairs. Not that she tried very hard. Chapter 7. The House That Remembers. The door was gone. Not boarded, not locked. Gone. Where it had once stood, there was only an unbroken stretch of wallpaper, yellow and curling faintly at the corners like a mouth preparing to smile. Evelyn pressed her palm to it. Warm, pliable, throbbing faintly like skin. She did not scream. She had stopped screaming days ago, she realized, though she couldn't recall the last time she'd tried. There was a peace in the silence, a hush like wool over the ears, a stillness that slowed her breathing and softened the edges of her thoughts. It was easier not to remember. She tried the window next. It opened easily, welcoming even. But the view had changed. The garden was gone, the hedge, the porch, the cracked sidewalk. In their place was a wide, empty field under an unmoving sky. Pale, colorless, timeless, like the world had stopped dressing itself each morning. She did not attempt to climb out. Something about the stillness warned her. You'd fall forever. That night, she heard the mirror whisper again. The voice was clearer now, closer. Not inside the glass anymore, but in the walls, in her pillow, beneath the bed. This house remembers everyone, it said, but not all at once. Evelyn sat up, hands curled tightly in her lap. What does it want? She whispered. The wallpaper rustled. The mirror smiled. To be known. Later, She wandered the room and found new items on the shelf. A child's shoe, a thimble, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses with a cracked lens. They hadn't been there before. Or perhaps they had. One of them, an ivory-handled brush, felt familiar in her hand. Her thumb fell instinctively into a worn groove along the edge. There was hair still caught between the bristles. Gray and long. She had the absurd thought, "It's mine," but her own hair was short, wasn't it? She found a letter tucked inside the dresser drawer. The paper was brittle and water-stained, written in a heavy slant. "To whomever comes next, you'll think it's the house. It isn't. It's you. The room only reflects." It wasn't signed. She folded the paper and placed it back where she found it, hands shaking slightly. Outside the window, the field had grown darker. Not nightfall, just darker. A thicker shadow cast over nothing, and on the mirror's surface, her reflection now stood even when she didn't. Chapter 8. The Ones Who Stayed. On the 16th day, Evelyn awoke to voices in the hallway. Not near the door, not right outside, but distant, muffled, as though heard through layers of plaster and time. She pressed her ear to the wall and waited. A woman was humming. The tune was simple and sad, familiar in the way old lullabies are. Between the verses, she heard a man clear his throat and say something low and warm, like a bedtime story meant to soothe a child. Evelyn whispered, "Hello?" The voices stopped, then a pause, then the woman answered, "Oh, I remember you." Evelyn staggered back. The wall pulsed once beneath her hand, then settled again into stillness. The air smelled faintly of mothballs and perfume. That night, she didn't sleep in the bed. She lay on the rug beside the wall, her cheek pressed to the floorboards, waiting, listening. They came to her slowly, the voices, not from beneath now, but from around, in the walls, behind the mirror, between the seams of the room. Some whispered in sorrow, some in song. Some didn't speak at all, only breathed, soft and grateful, like the sound of someone finally resting after a long walk home. Evelyn understood. These were the ones who stayed. Not trapped, exactly. Not prisoners, but remembered. The room was full of them. Not ghosts, not quite. Just impressions. Lingering warmth where a body had once stood. A sigh in the corner where someone had once wept. A shadow on the floor that flickered even when no one passed by. She began to recognize them by presence. There was the little boy with the button missing from his coat. The tall man who never sat, only stood near the dresser with one hand always in his pocket. The girl who braided her hair again and again, even though she had no mirror. And the old woman, whose perfume clung faintly to the pillow every morning. Evelyn greeted them each night as she drifted toward sleep. She asked no questions. They offered no answers, but she began to understand what it meant to belong. The field outside the window had changed again. There was a tree now, only one, dead and still, but somehow familiar. When Evelyn placed her hand on the glass, she could feel the pulse of roots below, slow, patient, like memory itself. She turned away from the window and said aloud, quietly, "I'm not leaving, am I?" The mirror rippled once and smiled. The voices whispered in chorus, "Number, you've been here all along." Chapter 9. The Room. Remembers. She no longer dreamed in pictures, only feelings now. Warmth, weight, the ache of memory pressing gently on her ribs like a sleeping cat. When she opened her eyes in the mornings, she didn't remember her name right away. It would come to her eventually, in small pieces, like leaves drifting in through a window left open. She didn't mind. The room was full of names, and hers was only one of them. Sometimes she thought she heard her name being whispered by the curtains. Other times it came from inside the mirror, low and musical, like someone humming the first note of a song and waiting for her to join in. She had stopped asking what day it was. There was no calendar now. She had torn it down, gently, when she realized the dates had started repeating. April 9th had come 3 times. July never arrived at all. Some mornings, the sun never rose, and she sat in the low light of the room, waiting, feeling no urgency to move. The others were more visible now. She saw them clearly, not just as shadows or sounds, but as people. The boy with the buttonless coat sat on the windowsill and watched the tree. He never spoke, but when she smiled at him, he blinked slowly and nodded once. The tall man paced less often. Sometimes he stood by her bed, and once he had rested his hand lightly on her shoulder when the whispering in the mirror grew too loud. The old woman with the perfume was brushing Evelyn's hair now. Her fingers were steady, cool. Her reflection never showed up in the mirror, but Evelyn's did. And her reflection had changed. It no longer moved quite in sync with her. It lingered a beat too long when she turned away. Sometimes it smiled when Evelyn did not. Once, it raised a hand to wave gently at her when she sat perfectly still. She waved back. It felt polite. There were fewer objects in the room now. The bookshelf had lost its books. The dresser drawers were empty, though she still opened and closed them out of habit. Her slippers disappeared one day, and she never thought to ask where they'd gone. The fewer things she owned, the more space there was for the room to settle around her. It had begun to breathe differently, slower, deeper. She could feel it now, the rhythm of it, the pulse, like a second heartbeat beneath her own. She began to move to it. She would hum along with the creaks of the floorboards. Her steps softened to match the sigh of the window frame. Even her thoughts came slower, kinder, more muted, like she was being gently rewritten. One evening, as the mirror darkened and the corners of the room blurred to dusk, Evelyn sat at the desk and took up a pen she hadn't remembered owning. She wrote a note. To whomever comes next. She paused and smiled. The rest came easily. Chapter 10. The Wall with No Door. It had been some time since Evelyn had touched the wall where the door used to be. She didn't avoid it. Not quite. But she passed it like one might pass a grave. Respectfully, without lingering. The wall had smoothed itself, grown paler than the rest, as though the house had exhaled and let go of the memory of hinges and frames. She ran her hand across it now, slowly. There was no seam, no break, only the faintest warmth, like skin after sleep. She remembered the day she had arrived, the landlady's dry smile, the hallway's tilt, the room's strange proportions. She remembered setting her suitcase down and thinking, I'll only stay a little while. She tried to picture the suitcase now, what color it had been, what she'd packed. She could recall the shape of it, but not the weight, not the things inside. Maybe she hadn't brought anything at all. Maybe the room had always been waiting for her. The tree outside the window had bloomed, not with flowers, but with paper. Hundreds of sheets, fluttering gently like feathers. Letters, notes, old receipts, fragments of memory pinned to its branches. They shifted in the breeze, rustling like voices. She could almost read them from where she sat. Some bore names she nearly recognized. Some were blank. One of them, she was certain, was hers. The boy with the missing button sat beside her now. His legs swung slowly beneath the window seat, never quite touching the floor. He pointed to the tree, not speaking. She nodded. Yes, it was time. She walked to the wall with no door. The wallpaper had changed. It was cleaner here, brighter. The crack that had once haunted her had sealed completely, as if the room had decided there was no longer a need for separation. There was only inside now. She placed her hand flat against the center. It pulsed once, then again, like a heartbeat. Then, without sound or ceremony, it opened, not like a door. There was no hinge, no shift in wood or frame. It simply became an opening, and Evelyn stepped through. She did not find stairs, or hallways, or even light. What she found was something softer, like being remembered by something old and kind and full of dust. She found warmth. She found stillness. She found the others. They welcomed her, not with words, but with presence, the quiet press of understanding, the relief of no longer needing to explain. She became part of the house. The room sighed once, satisfied. And on the shelf by the window, a new note appeared in Evelyn's handwriting. To whomever comes next. You'll think it's the house. It isn't. It's you. The room only reflects. Epilogue. Stillness. The room is quiet now. No footsteps above. No doors creaking. No whispered names drifting from behind the walls. Only stillness. The kind that lives in spaces long undisturbed. The kind that settles into corners and folds itself into dust. The kind that doesn't wait, but watches. The mirror remains, cracked, but clean. It shows no face, not yet. But its surface breathes softly, like something half asleep and dreaming of a memory it hasn't had yet. The bed is made. The chair is straight. A faint outline lingers in the cushion by the window, as though someone recently stood and will return at any moment. And on the shelf, the letter rests, unfolded, waiting to whomever comes next. Outside the window, the tree no longer blooms, but it remembers. Every leaf, every name, every sigh that passed through the narrow room with its slanted ceiling and two quiet walls. The room does not call to anyone. It doesn't need to. It only waits. And when someone comes, tired, displaced, looking for quiet, they will find it. And the room will remember them too. Just as it remembered Evelyn. Just as it always does.